For months, 120 days of silence, of searches, of sleepless nights, and still no answers. Nancy Guthrie, the Tucson, Arizona woman whose disappearance has gripped true crime communities and mainstream headlines alike, remains missing. And the deeper you look into the details of this case, the more extraordinary the story becomes. Here is what the public knows in its most stripped-down form. Investigators with the Pima County Sheriff's Department have acknowledged, on the record, exactly one piece of physical trace evidence recovered from inside Nancy's home. One single strand of hair. That is the forensic detail that has been circulating for months. One hair. And it has left investigators, journalists, and armchair detectives all asking the same question. How does a person disappear without leaving more behind? Today, the answer to that question may have just shifted in a major way. A retired FBI special agent, someone who spent a quarter of a century working some of the most complex federal investigations in the country, sat down with a national news outlet this week and said something the law enforcement community has been conspicuously unwilling to say publicly until now. He looked at the camera and described the opening of this investigation using one word. One word that changes the entire framework of how we understand what happened in those critical early hours. If you are following the Nancy Guthrie case and you are not subscribed to this channel, hit that button right now before we go any further. Every single time there is a real development, a press conference, a new source, a shift inside the investigation, I cover it the same day. Hit subscribe, hit the bell, and let's get into everything this retired FBI agent revealed this week. Because it is a lot. The man at the center of this story is Steve Moore, 25 years with the Federal Bureau of Investigation. His career runs through kidnapping cases, counterterrorism operations, and high-stakes federal prosecutions that most people never hear about by name because the Bureau prefers it that way. This is not a commentator or a podcast personality offering hot takes from a living room. This is someone who built federal cases for 2.5 decades and knows exactly how they are won and lost. Moore sat down this week with Brian Enton, Miami Bureau correspondent for News Nation, and within that conversation, he made a statement about the forensic evidence recovered from Nancy Guthrie's home that should stop everyone following this case dead in their tracks. Because here is the thing about that single strand of hair. Moore said it almost certainly is not the full picture, and when a 25-year FBI veteran says that, you take it seriously. He framed it in a way that is almost mathematical in its simplicity. Think about the odds, he said. Think carefully about what it would actually take for a person to enter a space, move through a room, make physical contact with furniture or a door frame or a countertop, and leave behind only one hair. One. Not two, not a cluster, not a fiber from a jacket sleeve alongside it. One single strand. Moore said plainly that is not how trace evidence works in the real world. If you find one, he said, there are probably 10 more. That statement deserves to sit with you for a moment. 10 more strands. 10 more pieces of trace material that, if they exist, have never been mentioned in a single press conference, a single official statement, or a single leak to any media outlet covering this case. If Moore is right, and his credentials make that a serious possibility, then the forensic picture investigators are actually working from inside this case looks dramatically different from what the public has been given. And that is exactly the point. That is how federal investigations are designed to work. When federal forensic teams process a crime scene at this level, and make no mistake, a kidnapping case that draws in the FBI is operating at this level, they do not collect selectively. They collect everything. Every strand of hair from every surface. Every fiber pressed into carpet fibers. Every partial fingerprint on a door frame or a cabinet handle. Every trace of touch DNA from a light switch, a countertop, a refrigerator handle. Forensic technicians move through a scene methodically, logging every single item as they go, building a chain of custody that must remain unbroken from the moment a first responder touches something all the way through to the moment a prosecutor presents it in a courtroom. The single hair that entered the public conversation is almost certainly, according to Moore, the least sensitive piece of what was actually recovered from Nancy Guthrie's home. Everything else? It stays locked. It stays internal. And that is not an accident, that is strategic. Here is the reason, and it matters enormously for understanding what we may be watching unfold. In a federal prosecution, evidence disclosure is a legal process. If a suspect's defense attorney knows every piece of forensic material that was collected before any charges are ever filed, before an arrest, before an indictment, they can begin building a legal challenge before law enforcement has even made its move. The FBI prevents that by maintaining absolute control over what becomes public, what stays internal, and precisely when any of it is revealed. The version of this case that the public sees is never the complete version. It is a curated version. It is the version investigators choose to release, and nothing more. So when Steve Moore tells a national news audience that the public has almost certainly not been told the full story of what was found inside Nancy Guthrie's home, what he is really saying is this. The investigators working this case may be sitting on a forensic portfolio that would fundamentally change public perception of where this investigation actually stands. 120 days without an arrest does not mean 120 days without evidence. It may mean something else entirely. But the forensic evidence is only one part of what Moore addressed this week. And honestly, it may not even be the most alarming part of what he said. Because Moore also went back to the beginning. He went back to the first hours after Nancy Guthrie's disappearance was reported, the opening of the crime scene, the critical window of time that every law enforcement professional in the country will tell you is the most important hours of any investigation. And he did not hold back. The word he used was chaotic. That single word, chaotic, applied to the early handling of a federal kidnapping investigation, coming from a 25-year FBI veteran who worked kidnapping cases professionally, is not a throwaway critique. That is a serious allegation about the integrity of this case from the ground up. In federal forensic protocol, the first hours at a scene are treated almost like a surgical environment. Chain of custody is not something that begins when forensic teams arrive. It begins the moment any first responder touches, moves, or even steps near any object in that space. Every item must be logged before it is touched. Every transfer must be documented with timestamps and signatures. Every step from the scene to the evidence bag to the laboratory to the courtroom must be traceable without a single gap. One lapse in documentation, one mishandled item, one moment where two officers are both handling the same piece of evidence without a log entry, and a defense attorney will find it. They are trained to find it, and they will use it. This is not a complaint about paperwork. This is a warning about whether the evidence recovered from Nancy Guthrie's home will be legally bulletproof when this case eventually reaches a courtroom. Moore directed that criticism pointedly at the Pima County Sheriff's Department and the way it managed those opening hours. And Moore is not the only voice describing those hours in those terms. Internal accounts from within the department itself describe a scene marked by conflicting information coming in from family members, communication breakdowns between sheriff's deputies and FBI agents who were simultaneously responding, and a level of confusion in those critical first hours that no one inside the department has been able to publicly explain or account for. Those are not details that reflect well on anyone, and they are details that a defense attorney in any future prosecution is going to spend a great deal of time focused on. Now put Moore's description of a chaotic early investigation against something else that happened this week, because these two pieces of information are directly connected and the connection is important. Sheriff Chris Nanos confirmed to People magazine that the Pima County Sheriff's Department is no longer serving as the primary point of contact for the Guthrie family. That role, direct communication with Nancy's children, including her daughter Savannah, who has spent 4 months quietly returning to her seat on the Today Show while privately waiting for any word about her mother, has been formally transferred to the FBI. Read that again. The county sheriff has been removed from the family-facing role in an active kidnapping investigation. The FBI has assumed all liaison responsibilities directly. That is not a routine administrative adjustment. That is a formal shift in command structure. And when you place it side by side with Moore's description of a chaotic opening investigation and his concern about the early handling of evidence, the picture that emerges is pointed. It suggests the Bureau may have decided it needed to consolidate control over every aspect of this case, including the communication chain, to protect what it has been building. The FBI does not insert itself into this position in a case because things are going smoothly. Federal agencies consolidate when they need to protect the integrity of their investigation from variables they cannot control. A county sheriff's department with communication breakdowns and a chaotic early scene is a variable the FBI would want to manage very carefully heading into whatever comes next in this case. What comes next is the question. And the answer to that question may depend heavily on a single piece of evidence that investigators have never discussed publicly, but that sources and analysts who follow this case have described as the linchpin connecting everything. We are going to get to that. But first, there is one more thing Moore said this week that deserves its own full conversation, because it touches on something most people following this story completely missed. Approximately 2 weeks before Mother's Day, Sheriff Chris Nanos made a public statement to reporters that generated headlines and prompted significant speculation from everyone following the Nancy Guthrie case. The sheriff stood in front of cameras and used a phrase that has stuck with investigators, journalists, and followers of this case ever since. "We are getting closer," he said. Those were his words. "We are getting closer." Steve Moore heard that statement, and he had thoughts. Moore addressed that phrase directly in his conversation with News Nation, and what he said reframes the entire meaning of those words in a way that is genuinely fascinating once you understand the context. Closer to what? Moore essentially asked. Closer to an arrest? Closer to a suspect? Closer to a result from the DNA analysis that was submitted to the FBI's forensic laboratory in Quantico, Virginia? The sheriff offered no specifics. He offered a phrase and nothing more. Moore said that kind of statement, vague, forward-leaning, nonspecific, is not information. It is a tactical communication choice. It tells the public nothing of substance while simultaneously creating the impression that momentum exists. That is a deliberate craft. That is law enforcement managing a narrative, not informing one. But here is where it gets genuinely interesting, and where Moore's thinking goes somewhere that most mainstream coverage of this case has not followed. He offered a second reading of those 3 words. We are getting closer. When a law enforcement official in an active kidnapping case steps in front of cameras and makes a statement that is deliberately vague, a statement that tells the public nothing concrete, they may not actually be speaking to the public at all. They may be speaking to one specific person who is watching, someone who has been paying very close attention to every development in this case. Someone for whom the message embedded in those words is not "we are making progress," but "we know more than you think we know, and we are almost there." A pressure statement, deployed at the right moment, can accomplish things a press release never could, can shift behavior, can rattle composure. It can create the kind of anxiety in the right person that produces mistakes. Phone calls that shouldn't be made, conversations that shouldn't be had, movements that shouldn't happen. Law enforcement uses this playbook. They use it deliberately and they use it well. Now step back and look at the full picture that has emerged just from this week alone. A 25-year FBI veteran says the public has almost certainly not been told the full story of the forensic evidence inside Nancy Guthrie's home. He says the early investigation was, in his word, chaotic, raising real questions about evidence handling in those critical first hours. The sheriff has been formally removed from the family communication role, with the FBI now holding all direct contact with Nancy's children, and a carefully crafted public statement from that same sheriff weeks before Mother's Day may have been less of an update for the public and more of a message directed at a very specific audience of 120 days. The FBI does not maintain this level of investment, full bureau resources, direct family liaison responsibilities, round-the-clock forensic analysis at Quantico, in a case it believes is unsolvable. That is not how the bureau operates. The FBI invests at this level because it intends to close the case. It invests at this level because it believes it can win. And according to Steve Moore, everything this investigation has been building toward, every strand of evidence, every forensic detail the public has never been told, every tactical decision made in those first chaotic hours, and every deliberate decision made in the 120 days since, it all connects back to one central piece of evidence. One piece that sits at the intersection of the crime scene, any potential suspect, and every scenario that has been laid out publicly since the day Nancy Guthrie went missing. When investigators move, that piece of evidence will be at the center of it. Subscribe right now and hit the bell icon so you do not miss the moment it happens. Click the video on your screen for the latest developments on this case.